So when we're finishing up, I guess it's actually been 2 weeks now. We were finishing up the topic of having a teacher, and one of the things I want to come back and revisit just very quickly is that the idea of having a teacher is for each of us individually. It's not for yes, there's value in having a group setting. There's value in discussion with having a buddy to chat on the phone with, but the real value of this is having a one-on-one teacher-student relationship with somebody who has the education, the background, and hopefully the relation, the affinity, so to speak. Again, it doesn't mean that you guys get along or that the person likes you and that you're great friends, but you have an affinity in the way that you communicate such that you can really bring out the best in who you are through them.
But their teacher need to be alive?
You should have, right, so their teacher, I would expect.
Let's say they're older.
Yeah, I would expect, and I think you'll find this among most people, that they had a primary teacher when they were, like you said, maybe younger. Somebody who they learned from, maybe if they're a rabbi, maybe somebody, they got their smicha, whatever. But they have to have a replacement. Maybe they still channel something from their teacher who's gone and share lots of wisdom with them, but they will have somebody else they consult with.
More than a certain age, then. Let's say it can't be more than 85.
Even at that age, you should always have somebody you're consulting with. I would be concerned if and I do think it's actually been the downfall of some major rabbis, that at some point they think, I got it, I'm good, I learned enough, I've had enough teachers in my life, I'm old enough, experienced enough, I don't need that person anymore. Yes, you do, you're still blind. You are still blind, there are still things you cannot see, you cannot know it all, you cannot be all-seeing, you cannot handle every situation on your own.
And people like the rabbis from Lubavitch and...
I don't know. I mean, that's a question for a Chabadnik. I don't know. Who would the Rebbe have asked? I don't know.
Do you think he had?
I don't know. It's not wrong.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
If in doubt, go to your wife.
Mm-hmm.
Unless she's a Scorpio.
I mean, there are actually a few rabbis who their wives are almost as famous as they are. Like Rabbi Akiva's wife was known to be like a real powerhouse. She was his entire motivation. Did he learn from her per se? I don't know.
She encouraged him to learn.
For sure.
She gave him a scholarship to Hebrew University.
That's right. The first ever full scholarship. Full ride for 13 years.
Okay, but if let's say you have a rabbi that you're studying with and whatever, and let's say, it would not eliminate him for somebody that you can deal, because generally with someone in this position, you're down, the student is here and the teacher is up here somewhere, okay? So even if that person isn't studying with somebody, you still can get a lot, from that person, right?
Even if that person doesn't have their own teacher?
Right.
I don't know how to answer that.
Would that eliminate, somebody as being
I would give it a second look. Let's at least say that. Make sure that you really feel comfortable that this person is,
right.
Yeah.
So when you're interviewing him, you find out who his Rebbe is?
Yeah. I think it's very appropriate. Who'd you learn from? Who is your Rebbe? It's a very fair thing to ask. Are you still learning from that person? Maybe, and if you feel comfortable with the answer they give you, I'm certainly not somebody to tell you that's wrong. But they definitely cannot be self-taught.
Okay.
I don't care how genius they are, And when I say self-taught, I mean even like spending a year or two with a rabbi or a teacher and thinking they can move on. You're talking about spending most of a lifetime. Right. Like what Elad is saying. When you've gotten up in years, maybe there is a point where you really can feel comfortable for most of the time that you have the experience without another teacher to consult with. But somebody should be able to quite readily tell you who their teacher is or was. And it should be somebody you notice they have a strong connection with, even if that person's gone. So we were finishing this idea of, once you understand what a teacher can do for you and can't do for you, and you really find somebody you connect to, the highest level of having a teacher is committing yourself to helping them fulfill their own mission. There are a couple of examples here that came up. So in the story of Joshua, Yoshua comes up in several sections throughout the Torah, but towards the very end, we basically find out that he's going to be the one to take over from Moshe. Moshe's not going to lead the Jewish people into Israel. He's going to die before he does that, and Yoshua is going to take over. And he knows it. It's kind of a weird dynamic that's going on at the very end of the Torah. Moses knows he's dying. Joshua knows he's taking over. How can student and teacher kind of coexist at the same time while the teacher needs to take over? But it's an interesting dynamic. It's worth studying a little bit. But even more interesting is to see how it is, especially if you read some of the Midrash, you can understand that Moses was teaching for the purpose of people or a committee basically taking over for him. And there's stories of him teaching like 70 elders. I don't think they called it a Beis Din or the Sanhedrin at the time. I don't remember exactly what the story was, but none of them, Joshua wasn't one of them. That's what I'm trying to say. Joshua was not one of those people who was being taught. And actually, here's something that I found in in the Midrash. So there's a reference to being of service, like Joshua. This is in Proverbs. And it says, "He who tends a fig tree will enjoy its fruit, and he who cares for his master will be honored." And then that proverb in the commentary refers to this Midrash. It says, "Your son." So this is God talking to Moshe. And he's saying, "Your sons, Moses' sons, sat for themselves and were not occupied with Torah. Yehoshua served you much and gave you much honor, and he would come early and leave late your council chamber. He would arrange the benches and roll out the mats. Since he served you with all his strength, he is worthy to tend to Israel so as not to lose his wage. Take Yehoshua the son of Nun in order to fulfill the proverb, 'He who tends a fig tree will enjoy its fruit.'" So he came to the council chamber, but he wasn't part of the council. He was the one arranging the benches and plugging the urn in so that they'd all have hot coffee. And, this was Yehoshua. And Yehoshua was the one who merited taking over from Moshe Rabbeinu and leading the Jewish people in Israel.
But it also explains why his sons didn't.
In a certain way, it does. It's true. It explains why his sons didn't, and that was something we talked about earlier as well. This idea that even though many times you do hear of a lineage or a dynasty of father-son, a lot of times you don't. Also, it's just not. It's not what works.
Look at our own, right?
That's right. Similar situation. You have the same relationship between the Ari and Rabbi Chaim Vital. So we talked about this a little bit as well. Actually, it's written in the writings of the Ari. So Rabbi Chaim Vital was the Ari's primary student. And actually, Rabbi Chaim Vital says, the Ari, my teacher, shared with me that he had no need to come in this incarnation, this Gilgul. He didn't need to be reincarnated except for one purpose, to teach me, Rabbi Chaim Vital, all the wisdom, and to write it down for future generations. It's the only reason he came to this incarnation. So you have a real, true teacher-student relationship here of somebody who's been charged with fulfilling their teacher's mission. That's all he was there for. Rabbi Chaim Vital was there to document the Ari's teachings so that in future generations the Ari's mission could be fulfilled. And it wasn't done in Rabbi Chaim Vital's lifetime either. Rabbi Chaim Vital, even though he wrote everything down, he was not given permission to reveal any of it. So actually all of the manuscripts were buried with Rabbi Chaim Vital, and at some point later Again, I don't remember the exact story, but Rabbi Chaim Vital's son received some type of Ruach HaKodesh, some divine inspiration, and he was given the heavenly permission to publish the writings of the Ari. It reminds me of a couple of other things. So the Rob Brandwein, I've read from him before. Rob Brandwein was the teacher of Rav Berg. These are some of the letters that Rob Brandwein wrote to Rav Berg. It's a beautiful book. It's really quite amazing. And one of the things that Rav Berg shares was he had met this man. He had met Rob Brandwein at his mother's funeral in Israel. And they had kind of an instant connection and had letters that went back and forth. But the Rob was still living in the United States at the time, had a business he was running. So he had arranged at some point in the future, I don't know, a year or two later, to go back to Israel and study with Rob Brandwein. And finally, he's able to arrange his business dealings, and he's able to arrange his family, and he's able to go for an extended period of time. And he arrives to learn from Rob Brandwein. And Rob Brandwein, the first thing he says to him is, here, you need to pack those books. And Rob Berg's like, what do you mean pack these books? I mean, I came here all this way, and this we're talking about the mid to late 60s here. This was no easy travel. And he says, that's what I have for you to do right now. We were able to pay for the printing, a new printing of the Zohar, and we have commitments that we need to fill. We told people we were going to be doing this. I need you to pack the books, and that's what's got to happen. And that's part of fulfilling the mission of your teacher. It was the very first lesson that Rob Berg learned from his teacher. And then Stuart can tell you, I was talking to Rabbi Wein about this idea, and Rabbi Wein shared with me many, many years ago. He went to his Rav Noach Weinberg, and he said to him, what can somebody do to repay, a debt that's that there's no way to repay, that you've just gotten way more, and of course, Rabbi Weinberg understood that Rabbi Wein was speaking about him. So Rabbi Weinberg said to him, you can dedicate yourself to fulfilling the mission. That's what you can do. That's how you can really repay, so to speak, a debt that cannot be repaid.
Play it forward.
What's that?
Play it forward.
Yeah, pay it forward. That's right. Okay, that finishes up the topic of teacher. So we're going to get into something else that, like I said, I think will be from my learning of just the very limited amount of actually written information there is on this. There's so much richness to it, and there's so many questions and answers that come from it that I think it'll really plant the seed for almost everything we're going to learn from here on. So most of what I'm going to share with you, I learned from what's called the Hakdama L'Sifra Zohar, which basically means like the introduction to the Zohar. Interestingly enough, it's not in the Zohar. It's actually a series of books written by this guy, Rav Yehuda Ashlag. Rav Ashlag was, I believe he was born in Poland and immigrated to Israel in the late 1800s. And he was really considered a great Kabbalist of his generation. He actually opened what was the first Kabbalah center in Jerusalem in 1922. And he wrote something called the Sulam, which is the Hebrew translation and commentary of the Zohar. The Zohar is written in Aramaic, and so this was the first ever complete Hebrew translation. It's a very famous book, HaSulam, or the Sulam. So he also wrote a 7-volume series called Talmud Esher Sfirot, which is the study of the 10 dimensions, the 10 Sfirot, the 10 levels. And I believe that's actually where this is published, where the Hakdama L'Sefer Zohar is actually published. So he kind of starts this. He has a very unique style of writing. Actually, you see this from a lot of great sages. They write with a series of questions. Say, so this question is kind of a starting point. which will logically lead us to this question, which will lead us to this question, which will lead us to this question, and then he'll start with a series of answers that by the time you get to the end, you've you've gone up the hill and you've come back down the hill and you have the complete set. And it can be confusing and complicated along the way until you get to the very end. And it will take us several weeks, I would say, to get to the end of even the first 30 or so sections of this writing. But he starts by...
Can we finish it in my lifetime?
How long are you going to hang on with us? I hope a long time.
55 more years, hopefully.
So, yeah, I think we'll make it. Depends on how fast I can talk.
Oh, those are two-sided pages.
Yeah,
One
that's
side
right. I
scrap?
didn't want to waste the paper. I printed on both sides. So, he basically starts with this idea of asking what was creation. Now, we talked about creation, the story of creation from a Kabbalistic perspective. We talked about the creation of the vessel. We talked about the fact that the light was hidden within the vessels. That the thought of creation was lehitiv l'nivra av, the idea that all created beings were created for the sake of receiving all the greatness that God has to give them, that they can receive from the light. Okay, so we talked about those ideas, but the one piece that we didn't talk about is what was it that was actually created, and this is the concept of yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. Because now in the I'll say in the modern world, but in physicality, we know there's conservation of mass, conservation of energy. These are scientific principles. There can be no destruction. There can be no creation. It's just transfer of things from one form into another. But at the very beginning, and when I say beginning, I really mean before time, there was a point where there was a yesh me'ayin. There was a something. That something was what we know of, or what we refer to as God or the Creator. And there was nothing. There was nothing else outside of God. And again, we'll say that was before physicality, before time, before space, before motion. Sometimes when you read in scientific literature, you'll hear about the moment before the Big Bang was basically an infinitely dense mass, and being infinitely dense, basically what you're saying is it was pure energy. That's all there was. So again, it was so infinitely dense that it didn't really even take up space. I mean, those are some of the scientific ideas that come before the Big Bang, before we know of as the Big Bang. So even what we know of as the universe, it's not like it expanded to fill the universe. There wasn't even a universe to expand to fill. It was literally yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. So something had to fill that nothing. And what Rav Ashlag brings is this idea that in order for it to have truly been nothing, for it to have been a yesh me'ayin, and I think in Latin they you see it written ex nihilo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what I've seen written before. Something from nothing. So the nothing had to be something that was not in the something that was creating it. Am I making sense? It's kind of
up until that point.
What's that?
Can you say that again?
Yeah. So, I'm trying to think of a way to think of this physically. So, if I were to take like a cup of water, a full cup of water and an empty cup of water, okay, so you could say I've got something in this cup and nothing in this cup. So I'm going to pour the water into this cup. So now I've got something in the other cup. That's not what we're talking about here, because nothing cannot exist. The nothingness that's about to be created, what's going to fill the nothingness, cannot exist in the something, because then it'd be something from something.
So what do you mean? There was no cup? There wasn't water.
Or there was no water.
Right. Again, if we want to talk about it in physicality, all right, so you'd have to think, oh, if I had air in this cup
Okay.
and I go to pour it and water comes out, and water didn't exist in the universe before I did that. Didn't exist. There was no such thing as water until I took my air, which had nothing to do with water, no relationship to water.
We see it or we know it, maybe.
But it's an important idea. It's an important idea spiritually.
Like freezing gas that you don't
No,
see,
but
right?
we're gonna answer the question. What is it that filled the void? We're gonna answer it, and we're gonna answer it in just a minute. But it's important to start with the idea of whatever was within the realm of God, what He created was not. And there was only one ever Yesh Me'ayin. Everything since then has been just transfer of energy, conservation of mass, conservation of energy. That's all it's been. It's just been transferred from one form to another to another. There was only one thing that was not, because we always talk about God. God is everything, all powerful, all knowing, right? Merciful in judgment, and He's got every characteristic you can imagine. But there was one thing that God was and is still lacking, and it's the only thing that He needed to create in order for everything that you see here and in the entire universe over the course of 14 billion years and the creation of 7 billion people, that it's only one thing that ever needed to happen in order for all that to occur in the physical universe.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm about to tell you what it is, but go ahead.
Okay.
But first, the commercial break.
So you're saying that the Big Bang?
Yeah.
Okay, but I thought creation, those 7 days, was what created. So no. 'Cause isn't that what Torah says?
it's both. Remember, we talked about a few classes ago. We talked about this idea that it can't be that the story in Breshit is only the story of physical creation, because how can it be that there was light on day 1 when the sun wasn't created until day 4? Something doesn't match up, right?
But then you have to go to a long period of time. If you're going to go with the Big Bang, then you've got a whole lot more time to account for.
But it's what we're about to talk about is the only thing that needed to be created for that entire period of time to begin, for the clock to start, so to speak. And whether you want to say that clock started on what we call day 1 in the Torah, or whether you want to say that it started at time 0, 14 billion years ago, we are kind of talking about, relatively speaking, we're kind of talking about the same time.
So what is the time when I'm looking at a Hebrew calendar and it says 577, whatever it is? What time is that?
There's a few different explanations for what that time is, but Kabbalistically, normally the way we would look at that is we would say that's the time of the awakening of the consciousness of man.
Oh, so that's not when man started. So Jews don't have an issue with like prehistoric animals.
I can't tell you what Jews do and do not have a problem with, but I can tell you, if you are following a religion or a spiritual path that chooses to ignore science, you should find a different religion.
Even though it's not in the Torah?
Absolutely. Because the Torah, look at the Torah. The Torah is not just a book of stories.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
That was the book.
It absolutely is.
Okay.
It is.
Supposedly they contradict each other, religion and science.
Yeah.
Supposedly not.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Okay, obviously you know Gerald Schroeder.
Yeah.
Oh, he has a book in which I can't remember, I read it but anyway, he goes through and he kind of answers some of the questions I think that Sharon is asking, and he explains it so there is no contradiction. Okay, and I think that's one of the basic tenet in Judaism, but there's no problem between science and religion.
What's his
His name is Gerald Schroeder, Schroeder.
God created the physical universe that we know. God created the techniques that we have to date things. God created, so there can't, and God wrote the Torah. I mean, Moses wrote the Torah through God's command. So there just can't be a conflict. There can't be. So whether we fully...
So you
What-
would
no.
say that, or if I asked Rabbi Wine, he'd say that same thing?
Well, feel free to ask him. I'm not sure that I've ever
I think
heard him
I- I think
specifically
I've heard him
talk
say
about
it.
it, but
Okay.
But again, Gerald Schroeder was a world-renowned physicist,
Okay.
Harvard guy,
Okay.
and also I think he's an Orthodox Jew. But he writes a book and he goes through from the beginning, even explaining about the time factor.
yeah, there are many
Do you have
explanations
the title
for
of
it.
the book? Do you know what the title? Okay.
I mean,
Gerald Schroeder.
just as an example, one of the explanations I've heard is, that basically time is distorted based on how close you are to the Big Bang because of mass. This is the whole thing in Interstellar. If you saw the movie Interstellar, they wasn't that the movie where time was bent around the density of the? No, nobody saw it. All right, that's your homework
I've
assignment.
never
You got to
seen
go
it.
watch
I've
Interstellar.
never seen a talkie.
Or a movie in color.
Color, they have color.
So, life's in color now too. It's amazing.
Except with my dog.
So he goes through this idea that basically time was distorted at that time. So what we call a day actually legitimately was a day back then. I am not by any means saying that is the explanation. Okay, I'm just saying, if somebody were to tell you generally, like this is what I tell people who, from a religious standpoint, insist on standing by the idea that religion and science are in conflict. I tell them, fine, go jump off a building and show me, how your Torah, your Bible, whatever, who's going to save you? You're telling me you're not subject to the laws of gravity? It's a ludicrous idea.
No, I'm not arguing.
Oh, no,
with
no,
you. I
and
just
I'm
have
not-
never been able to
I-
see how
I-
you could get the same.
I totally
Everybody on the
understand.
same page.
I totally understand. And that's why I would kind of say to you, if somebody can't help you get there, or they want to tell you that, these are in conflict, and you just have to accept science and religion are on opposite paths. No, they're not. This is a problem. And actually, it's a really amazing. I wasn't really going to go into this much, but I was going to say this for a much later class. But for example, the Zohar speaks about the fact that the world was round, and it was written 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago. I mean, they didn't really discover that the world was round until about 450, 500 years ago, 600 years ago. It talks about the idea of. I don't remember exactly what it says. I don't remember anymore.
Yeah, I looked for it
It's-
3 months ago.
It's unbelievable. I mean, I have a whole sheet of these. I mean, there's several
it was
more.
already there.
Talks about the idea of basically what we would call good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. I mean, I'm not joking. Good fats and bad fats. It talks about the different workings of parts of the body. I mean, way before science had any. There were no medical sciences back there, or very limited. I mean, it was what the Egyptians thought, and they were a little backwards.
The laws of our kashrut is based on,
It's one of the ideas.
to eat because it's good for us.
It's
and
one.
good for the digestion. Who knew that?
It's one of the ideas that they bring. I mean, it's something that they suggest is that this was for spiritual, but it can also be considered for spiritual health.
Well, how? Well, the meat and the milk and all, it's all inside. Well, right, but it's what they said. If you eat it, the
It's-
kids don't, because the enzyme and.
It is a topic that's worth looking into further and building upon and understanding more. But it's important not to take it's important not to take anything that's in the Torah in a literal sense such that it drives your beliefs, because the Torah. I mean, again, somebody I heard one time, they said, if the Torah was just a book of stories, we would have certainly come up with a better one by now. So it can't be, and the Torah doesn't make any sense. It skips huge amounts of time, and that's not even getting into what you can see in the Hebrew that you can't see in the English, which is that it switches from masculine to feminine within the same sentence.
For me, it seems like a big story of, how do you say it in English, telefon shavur? Do they have telefon shavur? When you were sitting in a circle and I say one word or a sentence and it comes comes out to be a completely different one after it reaches the whole circle. So in a way, I think because it was a story that was told so many times, so many contradictions over there, so you need to sit down in the Gemara and in the Yeshiva and you need to figure out what the hell was going on all these years with this long story. The only thing that is simple in the Torah for me is Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. It's very simple. Don't do this, don't do that, etc. But all the rest...
And what if I told you that those aren't so simple either?
No,
Well,
Like-
because you...
Like what does
argue
lo
that.
tignov mean?
I have no idea. What is it in English?
Don't take something that is not yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if
What-
you take it from someone who stole it, is it his? You know, that's
Okay, but there are
That's
commentators.
just what I mean.
There are commentators that say that they're actually referring to kidnapping.
Mhm.
So why do they say that? Because later in the Torah, it refers to the idea of not taking that which is not yours. So there's a thought that, and it's kind of a separate commandment. So, which one is it? I mean, if you want my personal opinion, the reason why the Torah is written this way is because it was meant to be discussed and debated so that we could bring all the infinite possibilities of the Creator into our lives. And the Creator is infinite, which means the language was meant to be infinite. The wisdom that's embedded within it was meant to be infinite. I'll tell you one of the ways that I've heard I've heard the Torah referred to. I've heard people refer to the Torah like a diamond. Okay, so you look at a diamond, unless you're a diamond dealer. I don't think you are, but I'm not either. I look at a diamond, on the surface I can see one's a little brighter, nicer color, nice shape. But to a real diamond broker, I mean, they can look at this diamond and they can say, two that look almost identical to me, this one's worth $5,000 and this one's worth $500.
Yeah,
And this one over here that's made of cubic zirconia that you couldn't even tell was worth $5. And it's because they can look into the subtleties. They can appreciate all the little curves and the way they were cut just right, and in ways that you can't unless you learn it and explore it and
what
become
bugs me is everything is due to interpretations, whether it's the Oraita or the Rabbanan, which is different levels or different years. Eventually, it's all into certain decisions that were made
by
between
people. Right.
So, yes, they might be the wiser ones. They might be the one that had the light from above. But still, I think that for each and every individual in this life or this cycle, it's all about the freedom of choice and the ability to tell between good and bad. And eventually, the matzpun, or the inner feeling, the conscious, is kind of a guide, and if it's not a good one, because it's different for each and every one of us, then when you get to the judgment day, or whatever it is, then you have to give the judgment for that conscious that you had, or for those decisions that you made. They say that before you die, your life runs in a split of a second, Maybe something, of all the energies you ran through you all your life, in and out, that would be eventually the balance. But it's obviously much, much broader than this. But that's my problem with interpretations along the years of a book that went for thousands of generations.
I shared. I feel like, Stuart, I feel like you were there when I shared this. I don't remember exactly what the context was, but I shared with somebody like one of the reasons why I feel very comfortable here at this synagogue with Rabbi Wein, because Rabbi Wein will read what I'll call a very dry halacha, and then he'll say, so here's a story. I ran into this guy, and he ran into this thing, and he was talking to this person, and he paid them this money, and he tripped and fell, and whatever. Okay? And suddenly, the halacha comes alive.
Yeah.
It comes alive. Not from the standpoint of the physical law, that the person followed or didn't follow in that particular story, but because there is the sense that these are guiding principles for life that have the ability to awaken something within you. The laws of kashrut, though they are physical laws, and the laws of keeping Shabbat, though they are physical laws, have spiritual principles behind them. So this is why, we talked about this idea that we didn't, unless we talked about it earlier. So, there's a classic argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right? So there's always these classic arguments. One of the most classic ones was the story of the convert that comes to Beit Hillel, and he says, "Tell me the entire story. Tell me." What's that?
He goes to Shammai.
First, I think he comes to Beit Hillel first. Maybe he comes to Beit Shammai first. But we always tell the story from Beit Hillel's perspective. Comes to Beit Hillel, he says, "Tell me the entire Torah while standing on one foot." And Beit Hillel, and Hillel says to him, don't do unto others that you wouldn't want done to you. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. Beit Shammai basically tells him the opposite. He tells the convert, you got a lot of stuff to learn before you even have the nerve to come and ask me this question. I'm definitely paraphrasing, but that's more or less what he says. And that's the classic butting heads of Hillel and Shammai. They're both right, but Hillel is always coming from this perspective of build the spiritual character within, and the rest, which you have to learn. Remember, we talked about this, Pardes. I mean, it's the whole gamut from the literal interpretation all the way to the secrets. But if you learn the spiritual elements, the spiritual aspects, then when you hear or are taught or learn or read the physical laws, they will already awaken within you the spiritual aspects of what you are already a part of. So they will never drag you down like, oh, who says? Oh, and I read in this other book that this rabbi said the opposite, which you will read all the time. I mean, Hillel and Shammai argue, and the Rambam and the Ramban argue, and not to mention the Ashkenazim and the Sfardim. I mean, they have, yes, you can eat legumes, you can eat on Pesach, and no, you can't,
So where do you find this list of spiritual laws?
And that's what we're trying to reveal, at least in part, through a class like this. Trying to, as opposed to calling them spiritual laws, because what I would want to convey is that the physical laws are spiritual laws. That's what they are. They're one and the same. Just like religion and science is actually one and the same, because we're all talking about the same God who controls it, the same universe that we all live in. Right? We have to live within the realm of our religious beliefs and scientific principles at the same time. We have to deal with them both. Same thing that we have to deal with spirituality and physicality at the same time. And I think maybe even going back to one of the very first classes, I talked about this idea that the real characteristic of a true Kabbalist is somebody who can live in both the spiritual and the physical worlds at the same time. If you can accomplish that, now you've really, that's now we're talking Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's the level. I don't think any of us are going to get there in this lifetime. I hope we do. That is certainly what, part of what the coming of Mashiach will bring is an awareness that the physicality and the spirituality were the same all along. This idea that somebody's died will be revealed to be an illusion. Techiyat Metim, if you want to call it that, right? Litchiyat Metim or Techiyat Metim, the revival of the dead. What dead? What it is it's removing the curtain between the physical and the spiritual world and helping you see there was what death? What was there? But we all have the ability to live in that realm at the same time. The closest that we can get to it in this lifetime, the way I would see it is, you learn the deeper secrets. You learn the v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, the loving your neighbor as yourself, and you build upon that all the teachings and rules and laws and whatever way you call them, halachot, chukot, mishpatim, whatever you want to call them, okay? And And you build upon those in a way that you're always seeing the non-physical, the spiritual aspect within it, and it's always awakening something within you. And again, that's why I come back to what I was saying. This is the value that I find in learning from a spiritual teacher like Rabbi Wein. It's why myself and my wife and our friends feel, I don't even want to say contented here, I want to say happy and joyful here.
Well, what's the purpose of it's something that I don't understand. What's the purpose of living the life? Oh, okay, let's make it in living life. If you need to do Vagita Bam Yomam Balaylo, no, Agita Bam Yomam Balaylo, it means you have studied it day and night, no, in the yeshiva or whatever. So it's almost that this life is dedicated to learn about the next life. So if we're here to live this life and make the tikkun, the correction and everything, it's almost contradicting. So why are you sitting and learning about the next life when you're actually in this life and you need to do the tikkun?
So let's get into some contradictions. We got about 5 or 6 more minutes to get into the biggest. It's okay. It's okay because I hope it will keep on coming out. That's the point of these classes, to allow these things to come out, and hopefully to each time just a tiny tick ahead of where you were before. Something will give you something to think about, and you'll just end up just a little bit further down that road than before. Okay. So we'll just get to the big conflict, the big overriding idea here. It'll be something for everybody to sit with for the next week until we have our next class. So we were discussing the idea of yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, that
You have to tell us what's the,
and the nothing, excuse me.
the big old thing. Yes.
Right, we've got this nothing that we need to fill, and it's got to be filled with something that's not within the Creator. And there's one characteristic that we've talked about a few times that is not within the Creator. The Creator does not have the ability to receive. The Creator is all-powerful, all-knowing, only has the ability to give and share. You couldn't give something back to God if you wanted to, because what are you going to give Him that He doesn't already have?
So that cancels Shavuot, I guess.
We'll get there. So the thing that was created is basically what allows receiving, which is desire. Desire. A desire for all of the goodness that God wants to share. So God created us with the thought of leitiv l'nivra'av, to benefit the created, right? How do you benefit the created? To benefit the created, they have to have a desire for that which you're trying to benefit them with. So if you're walking along the road and you see a penny and you don't have any desire for that penny and you just pass right by it, what good was that penny? It had no value, so to speak, right? It wasn't anything you had a desire for, and therefore you're not going to receive it. But if you see $5,000 laying on the street, which looks really darn good, and I'd love to put that in my pocket, I'd love to receive that. That sounds really terrific, because you've got an innate desire for that quantity of money. And you're going to take on receiving the goodness that comes from that money, that physical, whatever it is. And that's true of basically everything in this world. You won't find value in it unless you have a desire for it. And you won't really be able to receive it unless you awaken that desire within you. And the proportion of your happiness that you get from receiving something is directly related to what your desire is for it. Again, going back to the idea of the penny. Or you get a gift for your birthday that you didn't want to begin with. Well, you're not going to be too happy with it. It doesn't matter that it was a gift from a friend. And that's why people say that it's the thought that counts, right? Because if you are somebody who is awakened to the idea of the way they care about you, which you do have a desire for. I have a desire to receive a gift, not because I want the gift, but because I want to receive your friendship and your consideration. It's a thought that counts. I find value in that. I find happiness in that because I had a desire to receive your generosity. It has nothing to do with what's under the wrapping paper or inside the box. I had a desire to receive that generosity, and therefore, in direct proportion to that desire, I receive happiness. A baby or child is kind of the opposite of that, right? They don't really know for nothing about how much you care about them, except for about the nice things you give them. When they're a baby, they want the warm bottle. When they get a little bit older, they want the toy that they saw in the catalog or on the TV. That's what they want. That's what they have a desire for. And if they don't have the desire for whatever it is, no matter how much money it was worth, no matter how much you invested in it, they're not going to receive any happiness from it. And they're going against creation. Creation was of the thought that you will, that the created will benefit from that which the Creator has to give. So if you don't receive any joy from it, if you don't receive any benefit from it, you are blocking creation. That's what you're doing. And creation is something that's going on all the time, constantly. The world is basically being recreated every second. So you are literally blocking creation if you don't receive joy and happiness and fulfillment and benefit from that which you are receiving.
What are you talking about? You're almost making it sound like it's almost in any interaction.
It's in any interaction. It's in absolutely any and every interaction. It's even talking about, we talk about this idea of halamed, Ezel Chacham halamed mikol adam, who's the wise one, the one that learns from every person, right? So if you've got the desire to learn from every person, every situation, every stub toe, if you have that desire within you, you will constantly receive benefit from it. You will constantly receive a benefit from everything that's happening to you every second, all the time. You won't see it as happening to you, you'll see it as happening for you. Because there's no other possibility. That is what the thought of creation was. The thought of creation is that you will benefit from it. It can't be that you're not benefiting from it. The only reason you're not benefiting from it is because you didn't awaken a desire to receive the goodness that was coming to you from it. All right? So we're going to finish with one other little piece of this idea that I hope will be something good for you to sit with again until we have our next class. So there's an idea that the Kabbalists talk about that the soul of man is actually a spark of God Himself, a part of God Himself. And one of the ways that they illustrate this is they talk about the soul is to God like a stone is to the mountain. The stone and the mountain are the same, right? They're of the same physical characteristics, the same makeup, but at some point the stone became separated from the mountain. It was knocked off through some dramatic physical event, an earthquake. Somebody came along and chopped it off with a chisel. But at the end of the day, the stone and the mountain are the same thing, right? So, in order for the stone to return itself to the mountain, it has to come back to what we call similarity of form. We talked about this idea before. An affinity, anytime you want to connect to a person, a thing, God, the goal is to be like that person, to have an affinity, to have similarity of form. That's how two people create a friendship. They have things in common, things they like together, things they like to do together, things they like to talk about together. And it's true of our relationship with God as well. The way that we become connected to God is we behave like God. Okay? There's only one little problem with that, and this is where we're going to leave it. What we just said tonight, we created a huge conflict. God gives, can't receive. Man receives and has nothing to give back to God because God can't give. What are you going to do with this? We'll get there. But the rest of what's kind of on the plate from the idea of yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, is getting to how is it that you can create similarity of form with your Creator and become close to God when you are the polar opposite. That's what you are. Rabbi Wein told a great little story about, I don't think it was this past Shabbat, I think it was the Shabbat before. His third son got engaged. Was that just this past Shabbat?
Past about, I think, I thought it was on
Because they were away, I think they were away the week before.
So, one of his sons got engaged, and there's been a great deal of celebration. He's been very sharing with the community about different things going on. So he gave a drasha this past Shabbat, and the kind of the last part of his drasha, he was talking about words of advice for two people who are getting married. And he shared what came from his rabbi. So his rabbi, I believe it came from his rabbi. Anyway, came from one of his rabbis. He said, something you need to learn when you're entering into a marriage is that you are a selfish animal. You were created as a selfish animal. That's what you are. That's what you will always be. You will die a selfish animal. That's the way it's going to go. So, how is it that you bring somebody else into your life? You expand your selfishness to include that other person. That was the idea that he was bringing, okay? That basically you become selfish on their behalf, okay? And he didn't go into too much detail about it, but like one idea that you might have is when you have a spouse or a loved one or a good friend, and you're happy for them for the thing that they receive, then that's kind of the idea of expanding your selfishness to include them. Okay? I'm selfish to see that their selfishness is fulfilled, and I'm happy and awoken by everybody being fulfilled in that way. That's the expansion of the selfishness. And actually, I remember very clearly Rav Berg, he's in many of his recordings, he would share this idea. You know, he was known within his community as being basically a spiritual giant. That was the way they referred to him. He learned from another Kabbalist who learned from another Kabbalist. He was involved deeply in the Zohar, talked about very, very spiritual matters. So they considered him to be a spiritual giant. And he would tell people over and over again, if you're seeing me only as a spiritual giant, you're missing one very important point. I'm the most selfish one in the room. I'm the most selfish one in the room. And he was telling people that to inspire them to become the most selfish people in the room. Selfish. So again, the idea, when you start to connect the dots, and again, that's where I'm going to kind of leave you for now, but if you connect the dots with the idea that you were created as a selfish animal, you will always be a selfish animal. You were designed for receiving. You were designed from the one thing that the Creator doesn't have, which is desire. That's the whole thing. And by being selfish, you are fulfilling God's will. That's what you're doing. All the things that you do in order to create that selfishness are fulfilling God's will. And again, I'll just bring back the one point. But by doing all of that, you are the opposite of God, and you couldn't be further away from Him, which we know is not the goal, because the goal is to be like God. So that's where I'm going to leave you. We'll get back into that, and I hope that we'll expand upon that. And like I said, this teaching, this idea, is really the seed level for why does evil exist in this world? Why do we need to die? Why do we need the concept of Mashiach? Why do we need any of this? And what really is Mashiach? It all comes from the idea of desire being the opposite of God, and yet being exactly the key element in the aspect of creation to fulfill the original thought. How are we doing for scheduling next week? Is anybody out of town? Is everybody out of town? I'm around.
I'm here.
We're good? Okay.
Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, right?
What's Monday, Tuesday? Yeah.
You're gonna have the class, right? Monday, Tuesday.
Every night.
Tuesday, Thursday.
We'll finish it by then.